hoping some women realize that they are leaving a type of blueprint on social media when they post. And by what I mean is, I just watched a video about this woman giving her list of absolute no's to men, and she wouldn't date him if, like, one of the things was wearing Crocs. Whatever, you have your list, that's fine, your list of standards, and they weren't even like standards. It was like, don't listen to Taylor Swift. Anyway, so I notice there's a comment, and it says, a man's comment. He says, being 37 and having a list of standards is, it was something, whatever. So I click on the comment because she did a video to that comment. And then in that video, she says, we're not dating because we want to stay single, and we have no problem finding you, blah, blah, blah. But you quite literally just made a video about how you have standards and you're in the dating scene at 37, and now you're saying you're staying single. So you're just out in these streets fucking with men's emotions, knowing damn well you don't want to be in a relationship and you're going to be staying single. Like, how is that fair to men? Absolutely zero accountability. You're literally making a video about how you have standards and then making another video about how you're not going to be dating anybody and you're going to be single. Like, do we just not have comprehension skills anymore? You're contradicting yourself. I cannot.
For a very long time, society assumed something about men that turned out to be completely wrong. It assumed that no matter how much pressure was applied, no matter how much blame was placed on them, no matter how often they were told they were the problem, men would always come back. They would always apologize, always adjust, always try harder, and always re-enter a system that asked more of them while offering less in return. What nobody anticipated was that one day men would quietly decide that they were done. Not temporarily, not as a protest, but permanently. And by the end of this video, you will understand why this shift is not a phase, not a trend, and not something that can be undone. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. That support matters more than you realize, and it helps keep these conversations alive and uncensored. Also, if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth in a world that is becoming increasingly unstable, check out Angry's Crypto Academy. Inside the academy, I teach you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, how to think long-term, and how to avoid the traps that catch most people off guard. The link is in the description of the video, so go check it out now while it is still available. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show direct support for the work that goes into them, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to support the channel and keep this content going. Now let us talk about what is really happening, because the damage is already done. For decades, men were told a very specific story about themselves. They were told that if relationships were failing, it was their fault. If marriages were collapsing, it was because they were not doing enough. If women were unhappy, it was because men needed to improve, adjust, learn, unlearn, and become something else entirely. That message was repeated so often and from so many directions that it became background noise, something men were expected to accept as reality without question. Over time, this constant messaging did not motivate men to become better partners. It drained them. It exhausted them. It taught them that no matter what they did, the goalposts would always move. Men were told they needed to provide more emotionally, financially, socially, and psychologically, while simultaneously being told that their natural instincts, boundaries, and preferences were flawed. They were encouraged to open up, but punished when they did. They were told to lead, but criticized for taking initiative. They were told to be strong, but then told that strength itself was problematic. Over time, this contradiction created a quiet internal conflict that most men never spoke about, because speaking about it only brought more criticism. At the same time, Women were elevated culturally in a way that was never clearly defined or justified. Phrases like the fairer sex were repeated without explanation, as if they were self evident truths. Men were subtly conditioned to see women as inherently more virtuous, more deserving, and more valuable in relationships, while men were framed as interchangeable, replaceable, and always one mistake away from being labeled the problem. This did not create balance. It created resentment, even if that resentment took years to surface. For a long time, men internalized this imbalance. They believed that if they just worked harder, communicated better, earned more, and sacrificed more, harmony would eventually follow. But what actually happened was the opposite. The more men gave, the more was expected. The more they compromised, the less their own needs mattered. Relationships stopped feeling like partnerships and started feeling like performance reviews where failure was always assumed. Eventually, men began to notice something important. They realized that they were not the sole cause of relationship breakdowns. They recognized that healthy relationships require mutual effort, mutual accountability, and mutual compromise. They saw that many modern dynamics were structured in a way where one side was encouraged to express dissatisfaction freely, while the other was expected to absorb it silently. That realization alone changed everything. Men also began to understand that many conflicts were not about logic or problem solving, but about emotional validation without resolution. They learned often through repeated experience that presenting facts, solutions, or reasoned arguments rarely led to understanding. Instead, it often escalated situations and left them feeling drained, confused, and blamed. Over time, men stopped trying to win arguments because they realized the cost of engagement was always higher than the reward. This constant emotional labor took a toll. Men noticed that after conflicts, they felt depleted, while the other side often felt relieved or energized. They noticed that expressing frustration was framed as aggression, while emotional outbursts were framed as authenticity. These double standards did not create closeness, they created emotional distance. Men did not become cold overnight, they became tired. As this fatigue built, many men made a quiet decision. They stopped chasing approval. They stopped arguing. They stopped trying to prove their worth in spaces that seemed determined to misunderstand them. Instead of reacting, they withdrew. Instead of demanding change, they opted out. What society mistook for apathy was actually a deliberate choice to protect peace. This withdrawal was not dramatic. There were no mass protests or public declarations at first. Men simply stopped participating. They spent more time alone. They invested in hobbies, personal goals, physical health, and financial stability. They found that solitude, once portrayed as a failure, offered something relationships no longer did: calm. In that calm, many men rediscovered who they were without constant judgment. Meanwhile, broader cultural narratives continued as if nothing had changed. Men were still blamed for social issues, still told to step up, still expected to rescue systems that no longer respected them. But this time, the response was silence. Men were no longer arguing back because they were no longer listening. And as economic conditions worsened and social safety nets strained under pressure, a new tension emerged. The same structures that encouraged independence from men now struggled to function without them. The state could not replace the stability once provided by intact families and cooperative partnerships. As inflation rose and financial pressures increased, many people began to feel the consequences of decisions made decades earlier. At this point, some voices began calling for men to return, to re engage, to rebuild what had been dismantled. But the response was not enthusiasm, it was indifference. Men had already adapted to a different way of living. They had already accepted that peace was found away from constant conflict, not within it. This is where many people misunderstood the situation entirely. They assumed men were waiting for an apology or a policy change. They assumed men were temporarily frustrated, and would eventually come back once conditions improved. What they failed to see was that men had crossed a psychological threshold. Once someone learns they are happier without a particular dynamic, it becomes almost impossible to convince them to re enter it. Another factor accelerated this shift even further. Intimacy, once viewed as a mutual expression of connection, became transactional in many modern relationships. When something that should be freely shared becomes a bargaining tool, it loses its meaning. Many men began to see risk where they once saw desire, liability where they once saw closeness. This did not make them bitter, it made them cautious. Public narratives did not help. When surveys and discussions framed men as inherently dangerous or untrustworthy, it sent a clear message about how society viewed them. In one widely discussed example, some women stated they would rather encounter a wild animal than a man in a hypothetical scenario. Men listened. They did not argue. They simply accepted the implication and adjusted their behavior accordingly. If they were viewed as threats by default, withdrawal was the most logical response. As these dynamics played out, some men chose a different path entirely. Rather than disengaging completely, they looked elsewhere for relationships built on mutual respect and shared values. In other parts of the world, traditional expectations around partnership, family, and cooperation still existed. For men who still desired relationships, these environments felt more stable and predictable. This shift was not about superiority or resentment. It was about alignment. People seek environments where effort is reciprocated and boundaries are respected. When those conditions disappear in one place, people naturally look elsewhere. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. Throughout all of this, voices like Kevin Samuels warned that consequences were coming. He often spoke about accountability, long term outcomes, and the inevitability of social cycles. His phrase about winter arriving was not a threat, it was an observation. Systems that consume without replenishing eventually collapse. What we are witnessing now is not a sudden rebellion, it is the result of decades of cultural conditioning meeting reality. Men did not wake up one day and decide to abandon dating, marriage, or traditional relationships. They arrived at that conclusion slowly through lived experience, repeated patterns, and hard earned clarity. And this is only the beginning of the conversation, because once you understand why men walked away, the next question becomes far more important. What happens next when an entire segment of society decides that peace is worth more than participation? To understand where this is going, you have to stop looking at this as a disagreement between men and women and start looking at it as a systems failure. Systems fail when incentives are misaligned for too long, when effort is punished instead of rewarded, when accountability flows in only one direction. For years, men were told that relationships were the ultimate measure of success, that commitment was maturity, that sacrifice was noble, and that endurance was love. What they were not told was what happens when sacrifice becomes expectation and endurance becomes obligation. Men entered relationships believing they were building something together. What many discovered instead was that they were maintaining something alone. They were expected to be emotionally present, but never emotionally affected, financially supportive, but never financially strained, assertive, but never authoritative, confident, but never self assured. Any deviation from this narrow path was met with criticism, not conversation. Over time, men learned that silence was safer than honesty. This conditioning started early. Boys were taught to manage their emotions so others would feel comfortable. Girls were encouraged to express theirs so they would feel validated. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but the imbalance it created became a problem later in life. When those boys became men, they found themselves responsible for not only their own emotional regulation, but also for absorbing the emotional turbulence of others. That weight accumulates even when no one acknowledges it. As adulthood progressed, the messaging intensified. Men were told that their presence was optional, but their resources were essential, that they should compete endlessly to prove worth, but never expect loyalty in return, that they should adapt to every shifting expectation while remaining stable and predictable themselves. Relationships stopped being mutual journeys and became tests men felt they could never pass because the grading criteria kept changing. At some point, men began asking a question they had never been encouraged to ask before. What am I getting out of this? Not in a selfish way, but in a human way. Peace matters, respect matters, being heard matters. When the answer to that question became increasingly unclear, men did something radical. They stopped asking it out loud and started answering it privately. What followed was not rage, it was detachment. Men did not burn bridges, they simply stopped crossing them. Dating apps became less appealing. Social spaces, once centered around interaction, became places men passed through rather than lingered in. Marriage, once framed as a milestone, became a risk assessment. The romantic idealism that fueled generations quietly evaporated. This detachment was often misinterpreted as bitterness. It was not. Bitterness is loud. What men experienced was resignation, the kind that comes from understanding that effort does not guarantee outcome. That realization changes behavior permanently. Once someone internalizes that truth, they stop investing energy where returns are consistently negative. Society continued operating as if male participation was automatic. Campaigns, conversations, and cultural narratives assumed men would adapt again. That assumption was rooted in history. Men always had before. What changed this time was the availability of alternatives. Solitude became viable. Digital communities replaced social pressure. Financial independence became more attainable outside traditional structures. Men discovered that happiness was not contingent on approval. The economic dimension of this shift cannot be ignored. For decades, many women were encouraged to prioritize career over partnership, independence over interdependence, and personal fulfillment over long term stability. That choice was framed as empowerment, and for some it was. But empowerment without infrastructure eventually runs into limits. When economic conditions tighten, when support systems strain, and when time becomes less forgiving, the cost of those choices becomes visible. At that point, some began looking back toward men, not as partners, but as solutions, as providers, as stabilizers, as problem solvers. But the tone had changed. The appreciation was transactional, not relational. Men sensed this immediately. Being needed is not the same as being valued. Many had already learned that lesson the hard way. This is why calls for men to return fall flat. They are framed around responsibility without reciprocity, duty without dignity, obligation without respect. Men are no longer moved by shame based appeals or moral lectures. Those tools lost their power when men realized they could simply walk away from the conversation entirely. Another critical factor is trust. Trust is not rebuilt through slogans or campaigns, it is rebuilt through consistent behavior over time. Men watched as standards applied selectively, as consequences were uneven, as narratives shifted to accommodate outcomes rather than truth. When trust erodes at that level, it does not come back quickly, if at all. This erosion extends into intimacy. When legal, social, and financial risks are perceived as one sided, caution becomes rational. Men are not avoiding connection because they are afraid of closeness. They are avoiding asymmetry. They are avoiding situations where accountability flows upward, but consequences flow downward. Once that pattern is recognized, avoidance becomes self preservation. Cultural responses to the shift often miss the point. Blame is redirected. New labels are created. Men are accused of being disengaged, immature, or afraid of commitment. These accusations mirror the same tactics that pushed men away in the first place. They do not invite dialogue, they reinforce withdrawal. What is rarely acknowledged is that men did not leave society empty handed. They left with skills, discipline, and adaptability. They built parallel lives that function without validation. They formed friendships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. They invested in health, finances, and personal growth without external pressure. Many found fulfillment they had been told was impossible outside traditional relationships. This does not mean men no longer care. It means they care selectively. They reserve energy for environments that reciprocate effort. They protect peace aggressively. Once peace becomes the priority, chaos loses its appeal no matter how familiar it once was. For the men who still desire partnership, the criteria have changed dramatically. Attraction alone is not enough. Chemistry alone is not enough. Shared values, accountability, and cooperation are no longer optional. Where those qualities are absent, men simply opt out rather than negotiate themselves smaller. This global realignment is already underway. Men who feel disconnected from Western relationship dynamics explore other cultures where expectations are clearer and roles are mutually understood. This is not escapism, it is optimization. People move towards systems that function. That is human nature. The idea that relationships between men and women in the West can simply return to a previous state ignores a fundamental truth. You cannot undo awareness. Once men see patterns clearly, they cannot unsee them. Once they experience peace outside a system, they cannot be coerced back into it through guilt or fear. What makes this moment different from previous social shifts is that men are not organizing. They are not demanding reform. They are not staging revolts. They are disengaging quietly and permanently. Systems can adapt to resistance. They struggle to adapt to absence. Absence creates consequences that are difficult to trace back to a single cause: declining birth rates, fragmented communities, economic instability, emotional isolation. These outcomes are often discussed separately, but they are connected. When cooperation breaks down at the most basic level, everything built on top of it weakens. The irony is that many of the behaviors now criticized in men were encouraged indirectly. Men were told to focus on themselves, to prioritize mental health, to set boundaries, to walk away from situations that felt unhealthy. They listened. They applied those lessons. The result was not what society expected. This is not a call to anger. It is a call to realism. Men are not returning to systems that require them to shrink, apologize for existing, or constantly prove worth. They are not interested in narratives that deny their lived experience. They are not motivated by promises that contradict observable patterns. What remains is a quiet recalibration, a slow acceptance that the social contract has changed. That participation is optional. That fulfillment does not require permission. Men are not waiting to be convinced, they have already decided. And this leads to the most uncomfortable realization of all. This shift is not temporary, it is generational. Young men are observing older men and learning from their outcomes. They are adjusting earlier. They are opting out sooner. They are building lives that do not rely on systems they do not trust. By the time this becomes widely acknowledged, the window for meaningful repair may already be closed. Relationships require trust. Trust requires accountability. Accountability requires humility. Without those elements, all that remains is expectation without foundation. At this stage, it is important to address something that often gets overlooked. When men walk away, it is not because they hate women. Hatred requires emotional investment, and most men have already moved past that stage. What replaces it is emotional neutrality, indifference. And indifference is far more difficult to reverse than anger. Anger can be redirected, negotiated with, or diffused. Indifference cannot. When someone no longer cares enough to engage, the relationship is already over. Men reach that state slowly. It happened after years of being told their concerns were invalid, exaggerated, or rooted in personal failure. It happened after watching patterns repeat despite promises of progress. It happened after realizing that accountability was always framed as something men owed, never something they were owed in return. Over time, men stopped trying to be understood because understanding was never offered. One of the most damaging ideas promoted over the last several decades was that discomfort automatically meant injustice. Men were told that if someone felt uncomfortable, someone else must be at fault. This framework eliminated nuance and replaced dialogue with accusation. In relationships, this translated into a dynamic where men were responsible for preventing discomfort, even when it was unreasonable or unavoidable. Living under constant threat of accusation does not create intimacy, it creates caution. As caution increased, authenticity decreased. Men learned to self edit constantly, to choose words carefully, to suppress reactions, to anticipate misinterpretation. This level of vigilance is exhausting. No human can sustain it indefinitely without consequences. Eventually, men chose environments where they could relax rather than perform. The public narrative often claims that men are afraid of strong women. That framing is convenient, but inaccurate. Men are not afraid of strength. They are weary of instability. They are wary of environments where strength is defined as dominance without responsibility. Mutual strength builds cooperation. One sided strength builds resentment. Another misconception is that men leaving dating and marriage are doing so because they failed. In reality, many of the men opting out are disciplined, financially stable, physically fit, and emotionally regulated. They are not withdrawing because they cannot compete. They are withdrawing because they do not see value in competing for something that does not offer proportional return. When men talk privately, patterns emerge. Stories differ in detail but align in outcome. Effort was given, boundaries were tested, compromises were made, expectations increased, appreciation decreased. Eventually, the realization set in that the dynamic was not improving with more effort. That is when withdrawal began. This withdrawal also exposed an uncomfortable truth about modern validation. Many men realized that their value in relationships was conditional. They were celebrated when useful and criticized when inconvenient. That is not partnership. That is utility. Being reduced to a function erodes dignity, no matter how it is framed. As men stepped back, something else happened. They gained clarity. Distance has a way of sharpening perspective. From the outside, patterns become obvious. Behaviors, once excused, become visible. Contradictions, once ignored, become undeniable. Men began connecting dots they never had time to see while constantly reacting. They noticed how language shifted to avoid accountability, how narratives changed depending on who benefited, how personal responsibility was emphasized selectively. Once these observations accumulate, trust erodes beyond repair. Trust cannot survive asymmetry. Many men also recognize that modern relationship advice was fundamentally mismatched to reality. Advice aimed at men often focused on self correction, self sacrifice, and emotional labor. Advice aimed at women focused on self fulfillment, boundaries, and entitlement. These two streams did not converge, they collided. The result was chronic imbalance. When imbalance persists, systems adapt or collapse. Men adapted by exiting, they reduced exposure to risk. They limited emotional investment. They diversified sources of fulfillment. They learned that companionship does not have to come with chaos. This shift also altered how men view commitment. Commitment is no longer seen as proof of maturity. It is viewed as a calculated decision, one that must justify itself through consistency and reciprocity. Blind commitment is no longer admired. Discernment is. Critics often argue that this mindset is cynical. It is not. It is pragmatic. Cynicism assumes the worst regardless of evidence, and pragmatism responds to evidence directly. Men adjusted behavior based on outcomes, not ideology. Another layer to this conversation is how male vulnerability has been handled culturally. Men were encouraged to open up emotionally, but the environments they opened up in were not equipped to handle it responsibly. Vulnerability was often remembered selectively and referenced strategically during conflict. Once that pattern is experienced, trust shuts down permanently. Men learned that privacy was safer than openness. That internal processing was safer than external disclosure. That stoicism was not suppression, but self defense. This is not a regression, it is adaptation. As these adaptations solidified, younger men observed closely. They watched older men navigate divorce, custody battles, financial loss, and social isolation. They internalized those lessons early. They adjusted expectations before ever entering serious relationships. This generational learning effect accelerates change faster than policy or cultural messaging ever could. The result is a growing cohort of men who are not angry, not lost, and not confused. They are deliberate, they are cautious, they are self focused in a grounded way. They build lives that do not rely on approval or validation. They do not announce their withdrawal. They simply structure their lives accordingly. Social institutions struggle with this because they are designed around participation. Schools, workplaces, governments, and media all assume a baseline level of engagement from men. When that engagement declines quietly, the effects ripple outward in unexpected ways. Declining marriage rates are not just about romance, they affect housing markets, consumer behavior, tax structures, and population growth. Declining birth rates are not just demographic data points, they shape labor markets, healthcare systems, and generational continuity. These outcomes are not isolated, they are interconnected consequences of disengagement. Attempts to shame men back into participation consistently fail. Shame only works when the person being shamed values the opinion of the shamer. Men who have exited no longer do. That leverage is gone. Attempts to entice men back, or through messaging about responsibility, also fail because responsibility without authority is exploitation. Men are willing to shoulder responsibility when they are respected, trusted, and heard. Remove those elements and responsibility becomes burden. There is also a psychological component that cannot be reversed easily. Once someone experiences sustained peace after leaving a chaotic environment, their tolerance for chaos drops dramatically. What once felt normal now feels unbearable. This recalibration is permanent. Men who live alone often report improved mental clarity, better sleep, improved physical health, and greater focus. These outcomes are not anecdotal, they are consistent. When people feel better outside a system than inside it, the system has lost its appeal. This does not mean relationships are impossible. It means standards have changed irreversibly. Men are no longer willing to negotiate basic respect. They are no longer interested in explaining their worth. They are no longer chasing approval. And for those who still desire partnership, compatibility has become non negotiable. Emotional regulation, accountability, cooperation, mutual effort. These are not optional traits. Where they are absent, men disengage early rather than endure. The idea that the shift can be reversed through cultural pressure misunderstands male psychology entirely. Men respond to incentives, not rhetoric. They adjust behavior based on outcomes, not promises. Until outcomes change consistently, behavior will not. What makes this moment historically significant is that men have alternatives that previous generations did not. Remote work, digital income, online communities, geographic mobility. These tools reduce dependency on traditional structures. When dependency disappears, coercion loses power. Men are not isolating out of fear, they are isolating out of choice. There is a profound difference between the two. Choice implies agency, agency implies permanence. As this continues, the gap between expectation and reality will widen. Institutions will demand participation. Men will decline quietly. Tension will increase. Narratives will intensify. But behavior will remain unchanged. This is the phase we are in now. The phase where the system realizes participation is optional, but does not yet know how to adapt. Systems often resist change until consequences become unavoidable. What comes next will determine whether any form of repair is possible. Repair requires humility. It requires acknowledgement. It requires consistent behavioral change over time. None of these can be rushed or simulated. Men are watching, not with anger, with detachment, with clarity, with patience. And once clarity replaces confusion, the path forward becomes very narrow. As this reality sets in, one of the most revealing reactions comes from how the situation is discussed publicly. Instead of asking why men left, the conversation often jumps straight to how to make them return. That framing alone exposes the problem. You cannot repair something by ignoring the cause of the damage. You cannot rebuild trust by pretending it was never broken. Yet that is exactly what many attempts at reconciliation try to do. Men are not confused about what they experienced. They do not need education campaigns to explain their own lives to them. They lived the patterns. They felt the pressure. They absorbed the consequences. When solutions are proposed without acknowledging those experiences, men read that as confirmation that nothing fundamental has changed. This is why surface level messaging fails. Phrases about equality, partnership, or shared progress sound hollow when lived experience tells a different story. Men are not persuaded by slogans, they are persuaded by consistency. They are persuaded by outcomes that match words. Without that alignment, trust cannot regenerate. Another mistake is assuming men are lonely and desperate to reconnect. Some are, many are not. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. Loneliness is the absence of connection you desire. Solitude is the presence of peace you protect. A growing number of men have discovered that solitude is preferable to chaotic connection. Once that preference forms, it reshapes priorities permanently. What often shocks observers is how quickly men adapt. Within months of disengaging from high conflict environments, many report feeling lighter. Decisions become simpler. Energy returns. Focus sharpens. These internal shifts reinforce the decision to remain disengaged. The cost of returning begins to outweigh any potential benefit. This also changes how men interpret opportunity. Invitations that once felt flattering now feel intrusive. Expectations that once felt normal now feel excessive. Standards that were once negotiable become fixed. This is not rigidity, it is clarity earned through experience. Attempts to pathologize this clarity often backfire. When men are told they are emotionally unavailable, afraid of intimacy, or damaged by independence, it confirms their suspicion that engagement will be met with diagnosis rather than understanding. That reinforces withdrawal rather than reversing it. There is also a generational disconnect forming. Older cultural narratives about dating, marriage, and family no longer align with the economic and social realities younger men face. Rising costs, unstable job markets, and shifting social expectations make traditional paths less accessible and less appealing. Men are adapting to conditions as they exist, not as they are nostalgically remembered. The idea that men should simply want marriage because previous generations did ignores context entirely. Previous generations operated under different legal frameworks, cultural expectations, and economic incentives. When those structures change, behavior changes with them. Expecting continuity without continuity of conditions is unrealistic. Another overlooked factor is how modern discourse treats male boundaries. Boundaries are celebrated when expressed by women, but questioned when expressed by men. When men say no, they are often framed as selfish, immature, or avoidant. Over time, men learn that enforcing boundaries publicly invites criticism. Enforcing them privately avoids conflict, so they choose the latter. This quiet enforcement is powerful. It requires no validation, no explanation, no defense. Men simply structure their lives to minimize exposure to environments that do not respect them. This is not protest, it is optimization. As this optimization spreads, social feedback loops weaken. Behaviors that once corrected themselves through mutual dependence now persist unchecked. When one side disengages, the other loses an important mirror. Without that mirror, self correction becomes difficult. This is where frustration grows. Frustration often expresses itself as blame. Blame feels productive but accomplishes nothing. It does not change incentives. It does not rebuild trust. It does not address underlying causes. It simply signals refusal to introspect. Men notice this refusal immediately. It confirms that returning would mean re entering a dynamic where accountability remains uneven. That confirmation strengthens resolve to stay disengaged. Another point rarely discussed is how male friendship dynamics evolve during this shift. As men withdraw from romantic pursuit, they often invest more deeply in male friendships. These relationships tend to be lower conflict, higher trust, and based on shared activity rather than emotional negotiation. The contrast is stark. In these spaces, men feel understood without explanation, respected without performance, valued without utility. These experiences recalibrate expectations. Once men experience relationships that function smoothly, tolerance for dysfunction elsewhere drops sharply. This recalibration also affects how men perceive compromise. Compromise is no longer seen as virtue by default. It is evaluated based on fairness. Mutual compromise builds trust. One sided compromise erodes it. Men are no longer willing to compromise themselves into invisibility. When observers claim men are abandoning responsibility, they misunderstand the nature of responsibility. Responsibility is meaningful when paired with agency and respect. Without those elements, it becomes obligation imposed rather than commitment chosen. Men are rejecting imposed obligation, not responsibility itself. The long term implications of the shift extend beyond relationships. When men disengage socially, civic participation declines, volunteerism drops, community cohesion weakens. These trends are already visible in many places. They are not accidents, they are downstream effects. Institutions respond slowly to these changes because they are designed for stability, not adaptation. By the time consequences are measurable, behavior patterns are already entrenched. This lag makes reversal difficult. Some will argue that men must be encouraged back for the sake of society. That argument assumes men exist primarily as a resource rather than as individuals. Men reject that framing instinctively. People are more than what they provide. Others will argue that men owe participation because of historical privilege. That argument fails because obligation based on collective identity rather than individual experience does not motivate cooperation. It motivates disengagement. Men do not see withdrawal as punishment. They see it as self-alignment. When alignment improves quality of life, it becomes non-negotiable. This is why many attempts at reconciliation feel performative. They focus on optics rather than substance, on language rather than behavior. Men notice the difference immediately. Another key factor is time. Time changes perspective. As years pass without the chaos men left behind, memory softens the urgency to reconnect. The idea of returning begins to feel foreign. Nostalgia fades. New routines solidify. Men build lives that function without romantic entanglement. They create rhythms that prioritize health, stability, and autonomy. Introducing disruption into those rhythms becomes increasingly unattractive. This does not mean men are closed forever. It means access is limited. Entry requires alignment, not persuasion. Demonstrated consistency, not promises. Mutual respect, not expectation. Where those conditions appear, men respond positively. Where they do not, men disengage without explanation. Silence replaces debate. Absence replaces conflict. This pattern is not dramatic enough for headlines, but it is powerful enough to reshape societies. Large scale change often begins quietly through millions of small decisions made independently. What many fail to grasp is that men do not need to justify these decisions. They are responding rationally to incentives. They are optimizing for well being. That requires no approval. As this continues, pressure will increase to reframe disengagement as deviance. Labels will multiply, narratives will intensify, but behavior will remain steady because behavior is grounded in lived benefit. Men are not waiting to be saved. They are not searching for permission. They are not confused. They are clear. Clarity is the most dangerous thing to systems built on expectation without reciprocity. Once clarity spreads, the old scripts stop working. And that is where we are now. When discussions finally turn towards solutions, the proposals often reveal how little the underlying issue is understood. Many of the so called fixes focus on surface behavior rather than structural imbalance. Men are told to communicate better, to be more open, to re engage emotionally, to try again with a better attitude. What is missing from these suggestions is any recognition that men already tried those things. Repeating the same actions while expecting different outcomes is not growth, it is denial. Men are not withholding effort because they lack skills. They are withholding effort because experience taught them that effort was not met with reciprocity. That distinction matters. Skills can be taught, trust cannot be forced. Trust must be earned through consistent behavior over time, and consistency has been absent for too long. Another common response is to minimize male withdrawal by framing it as a temporary reaction. This interpretation is comforting but inaccurate. Temporary reactions are emotional. This shift is behavioral. Emotional reactions spike and fade. Behavioral adaptations persist because they are reinforced daily by improved outcomes. Men wake up calmer. They go to sleep with fewer unresolved conflicts. They make decisions without negotiating their identity. These benefits compound quietly. Some attempt to reframe male disengagement as immaturity. That accusation collapses under scrutiny. Immaturity avoids responsibility. Men who have disengaged are often taking full responsibility for their lives. They manage finances. They maintain health. They plan long term. They simply refuse to carry additional emotional or social burdens that do not benefit them proportionally. Others claim men are abandoning women during difficult times. That framing ignores context. Men were present during decades of messaging that framed them as optional, problematic, or replaceable. When people are told they are unnecessary long enough, they eventually believe it and act accordingly. Withdrawal is not abandonment when presence was never valued. There is also a tendency to conflate male withdrawal with hostility. Again, this is projection. Hostility seeks confrontation. Withdrawal avoids it. Men are not seeking to punish anyone, they are seeking peace. Punishment requires continued engagement. Men have chosen disengagement. The most revealing responses come when men articulate their reasons calmly, when they explain patterns rather than emotions, when they describe trade offs rather than grievances. These explanations are often dismissed or reframed to preserve existing narratives. That dismissal signals that listening is conditional. Men notice this immediately. At this point, many men stop explaining altogether. Explanation invites debate. Debate invites misrepresentation. Silence preserves autonomy. This silence is often misread as inability to articulate. In reality, it is refusal to participate in unproductive dialogue. Another overlooked aspect is how masculinity itself has been framed. Men were told to redefine masculinity while being criticized regardless of how they defined it. Traditional traits were labeled outdated, new traits were labeled insufficient. The criteria shifted constantly. Men adapted by stepping outside the conversation entirely. By doing so, men discovered that identity does not require approval. It requires alignment between values and actions. When those align, external validation becomes unnecessary. This realization is liberating, and liberation is not easily surrendered. As men opt out, the emotional economy changes. Validation, attention, and commitment become scarcer. Scarcity shifts power dynamics. Attempts to restore balance through pressure or guilt only accelerate disengagement. Pressure repels when alternatives exist. This is why many men view current reconciliation efforts skeptically. They sense urgency driven by scarcity rather than reflection driven by accountability. They feel sought after as resources rather than as partners. That distinction matters deeply. Another factor complicating repair is memory. Men remember how they felt before disengaging. They remember walking on eggshells. They remember apologizing for misunderstandings they did not create. They remember being told to do more without being asked how they were doing. These memories anchor behavior. Time also changes tolerance. What once felt manageable now feels intolerable. Returning would require lowering standards, not raising them. Men are unwilling to do that after experiencing higher quality of life outside those dynamics. As this continues, the narrative gap widens. Media discussions grow louder. Online debates intensify. Yet behavior remains unchanged. This disconnect frustrates commentators who mistake noise for influence. Influence shapes behavior. Noise does not. Men are not persuaded by arguments about social good that ignore individual cost. Collective outcomes do not motivate when individual outcomes are consistently negative. This is not selfishness, it is rational decision making. When some men choose relationships abroad or within niche communities, it is often framed as STEM escapism. In reality, it is selection. People choose environments that align with their expectations. When alignment is absent locally, mobility becomes attractive. This mobility further reduces leverage. When exit is possible, coercion fails. This is a fundamental principle of systems. Retention requires value, not pressure. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men no longer believe change is possible within existing frameworks. They do not see incentives aligned toward mutual accountability. Without aligned incentives, reform efforts stall. This belief does not come from cynicism, it comes from pattern recognition. Men observed cycles repeat without resolution. They adjusted accordingly. Attempts to counter this by appealing to nostalgia also fail. Nostalgia romanticizes outcomes while ignoring causes. Men do not want replicas of the past. They want systems that function in the present. The longer disengagement persists, the more normalized it becomes. What begins as individual choice becomes cultural pattern. New norms form quietly. Dating, sex, marrying later or not at all, prioritizing autonomy. These norms spread without coordination. Young men absorb these norms early. They calibrate expectations before disappointment sets in. Prevention replaces recovery. This is a powerful shift. As prevention increases, participation declines further. Fewer men enter dynamics that previously drove conflict. This reduces visible tension, but increases long term fragmentation. Fragmentation is not dramatic, it is subtle. Fewer shared spaces, fewer mixed social circles, more parallel lives. This separation reduces friction, but also reduces connection. Whether this leads to permanent division or eventual adaptation depends on whether incentives change meaningfully. Incentives are not messages, they are outcomes experienced consistently over time. Men are open to outcomes that demonstrate respect, stability, and reciprocity. They are closed to narratives that demand sacrifice without return. The difficulty is that rebuilding trust requires admitting fault. Admitting fault requires humility. Humility is rare in systems built on moral certainty. Without humility, repair remains theoretical. Men are not demanding apologies, they are demanding proof through behavior. Proof cannot be rushed, it cannot be marketed, it must be lived. Until then, men will continue optimizing for peace. They will continue structuring lives that minimize conflict. They will continue choosing autonomy over chaos. This is not rebellion, it is recalibration. Recalibration continues quietly, one decision at a time, and that quiet is what makes it irreversible. When the conversation finally turns toward accountability, discomfort rises quickly. Accountability requires more than acknowledgement. It requires behavioral change that persists even when it is inconvenient. This is where most attempts at repair collapse. It is easy to speak about balance. It is much harder to practice it consistently. Men have learned to judge sincerity not by words, but by patterns over time. One of the core barriers to accountability is the belief that admitting fault undermines progress. In reality, refusing to admit fault freezes progress entirely. Men are not expecting perfection. They are expecting honesty. They are expecting symmetry. Without those elements, reconciliation efforts feel performative rather than genuine. Accountability would require acknowledging that many modern relationship norms developed without considering male cost. Emotional labor expectations increased, while emotional safety for men decreased. Legal and social risks expanded, while protections remained uneven. These realities were dismissed as exaggerations for years. Dismissing lived experience damages trust more than any single conflict ever could. Another obstacle is the tendency to reframe male disengagement as a communication failure rather than a trust failure. Communication breaks down when trust erodes. Fixing communication without addressing trust is cosmetic. Men do not need better scripts. They need evidence that engagement will not be punished. Evidence must come from behavior, not intent. Intent can be claimed by anyone. Behavior reveals priorities. Men are watching for consistency in small moments, how disagreement is handled, how boundaries are respected, how accountability is distributed when things go wrong. This level of scrutiny is not spiteful, it is learned caution. When someone has been burned repeatedly, they stop assuming good faith. They look for proof. That proof must be sustained, not symbolic. One of the hardest truths to accept is that some damage cannot be undone. Trust lost over decades cannot be rebuilt quickly. Men who disengaged years ago are not waiting to re enter. They have moved on psychologically. They have built lives that do not require reattachment. Expecting them to return misunderstands the permanence of behavioral adaptation. This permanence is what separates the shift from previous cycles. Earlier generations faced conflict but lacked viable alternatives. Today, alternatives exist. When alternatives outperform the original option, return becomes irrational. Men are not rejecting relationships as a concept. They are rejecting specific dynamics that proved unsustainable. This distinction matters. Where dynamics differ, engagement is possible. Where they remain unchanged, disengagement persists. Another requirement for genuine repair would be redefining respect. Respect is not agreement, it is not deference, it is recognition of autonomy and boundaries. Men do not require constant validation, they require consistency and fairness. Fairness includes emotional fairness. When emotions are weaponized rather than managed, trust dissolves. Men are no longer willing to participate in environments where feelings override facts consistently. Balance is essential. Fairness also includes legal and social fairness. When risks are perceived as asymmetric, avoidance becomes rational. Men cannot be expected to commit deeply while carrying disproportionate exposure. This is not fear, it is calculation. The difficulty is that addressing these issues challenges deeply held narratives. Narratives simplify complexity. Accountability complicates it. Complexity requires nuance. Nuance requires humility. Humility is uncomfortable. Many systems resist humility because it threatens identity. Admitting imbalance feels like admitting wrongdoing. But without that admission, correction is impossible. Men sense this resistance. They interpret it as confirmation that change is unlikely. That interpretation reinforces disengagement. Another factor is time horizon. Men who disengage are thinking long term. They evaluate decisions based on cumulative impact, not short term satisfaction. When long term projections look unfavorable, they opt out early. This long term thinking also shapes how men view children and family formation. Many decide that bringing children into unstable or adversarial dynamics is irresponsible. That decision reduces birth rates further. This is not apathy, it is caution. Attempts to counter declining family formation through incentives miss the emotional component entirely. Financial incentives do not offset emotional risk. Men prioritize stability over perks. As these patterns solidify, cultural expectations lag behind reality. Old assumptions persist even as behavior changes. This creates confusion and frustration on both sides. Men are told they should want what no longer appeals to them. This mismatch leads to increasing polarization. Conversations become defensive, positions harden, empathy declines. Without empathy, repair stalls. Men are often accused of lacking empathy during this shift. That accusation ignores the empathy men extended for years without reciprocity. Empathy without boundaries leads to depletion. Men learned that lesson painfully. Now, empathy is conditional, it is extended where it is mutual, withdrawn where it is exploited. This is not cruelty, it is self preservation. One of the most revealing aspects of the shift is how calm it is. There are no marches, no demands, no ultimatums, just absence. Absence is difficult to argue with. You cannot debate someone who is not there. This absence forces systems to confront consequences rather than arguments. Consequences are harder to dismiss. Declining participation speaks louder than any manifesto, and as consequences accumulate, pressure will increase to act, but action without understanding will fail. Repair without accountability will fail. Messaging without change will fail. Men are not opposed to reconciliation in principle. They are opposed to returning to dysfunction. That distinction is crucial. Any realistic path forward would require sustained change across multiple domains. Emotional norms, legal frameworks, social expectations, none of these change quickly. None of them change without resistance. Because of this, many men have already concluded that meaningful repair will not occur within their lifetime. They are not angry about this, they are pragmatic. They adjust accordingly. This adjustment is not pessimism, it is realism grounded in observation. Men are responding to what is not what is promised. As this continues, a new equilibrium will form. It will not resemble the past. It will not satisfy everyone, but it will reflect actual behavior rather than idealized narratives. Some men will form relationships under new terms. Others will remain solitary by choice. Both paths will coexist. What will not return is automatic participation. The era of assumed compliance is over. Participation must now be earned. That realization is uncomfortable for systems built on expectation rather than reciprocity. And that discomfort is only beginning to surface. As men move forward into this new reality, something unexpected happens. Instead of feeling lost without traditional milestones, many feel more grounded than ever before. When expectations fall away, clarity rises. Men begin defining success on their own terms rather than inheriting definitions that no longer serve them. Purpose stops being something demanded and becomes something chosen. This shift in purpose is subtle but profound. Men stop orienting their lives around external validation and start orienting around internal stability. They pursue physical health not to impress, but to feel capable. They pursue financial stability not to provide status, but to ensure freedom. They pursue discipline not to meet expectations, but to maintain control over their own lives. Without constant relational turbulence, men rediscover focus. Energy once spent navigating emotional uncertainty is redirected into creation, learning, and self mastery. This is why many men report improved mental health after disengaging. Peace allows growth, chaos interrupts it. This does not mean men no longer value connection. It means they value quality over quantity, they value depth over obligation, they value consistency over intensity. These values are incompatible with environments that reward volatility and punish stability. Men are choosing environments that align with who they are becoming. Identity reshapes itself. In the absence of pressure, men stop asking who they should be and start asking who they are. That question leads to honesty. Honesty leads to alignment. Alignment leads to peace. Once peace is established, it becomes the non negotiable foundation for all future decisions. For many men, solitude becomes a proving ground rather than a punishment. It reveals strengths and weaknesses without distraction. It forces accountability without accusation. It builds confidence that does not rely on approval. This confidence is quiet. It does not seek attention. It does not announce itself. It simply exists. This quiet confidence is often misunderstood. It is mistaken for detachment, coldness, or avoidance. In reality, it is stability. Men who are stable do not need to convince others of their worth. They know it internally. That knowledge changes how they move through the world. As men stabilize internally, their tolerance for dysfunction drops to zero. They do not negotiate peace away. They do not trade clarity for familiarity. They do not return to patterns they worked hard to leave behind. This is not stubbornness, it is self respect. When men encounter potential relationships now, they evaluate them calmly. They look for mutual effort rather than promises, emotional regulation rather than intensity, accountability rather than excuses. Where those traits exist, engagement is possible. Where they do not, disengagement is immediate and quiet. This selectivity is not cruelty, it is discernment. Discernment is the product of experience. Men did not arrive here by accident. They earned it through repetition, disappointment, reflection, and growth. The broader culture may struggle to adapt to the shift, but individual men are not waiting for cultural permission. They are building lives that function regardless of external validation. That autonomy is powerful. Once autonomy is achieved, surrendering it becomes unthinkable. What many fail to realize is that men walking away is not a rejection of society, it is a rejection of imbalance. Men are not opting out of contribution, they are opting out of exploitation. They will contribute where contribution is valued and reciprocated. This distinction matters for the future. Societies that want engagement must offer fairness, not rhetoric, not nostalgia, fairness in practice, fairness over time. Anything less will fail to attract participation. Men are not issuing ultimatums. They are making choices, choices based on evidence, choices reinforced by outcome, choices that improve quality of life. These choices do not reverse easily. The damage, as many now realize, is not emotional, it is structural. And structural damage requires structural repair. That repair has not yet begun in any meaningful way. Until it does, men will continue forward, not backward, and some will find partnership under new terms, some will not seek it at all. Both outcomes are valid. What matters is that choice has returned to the individual rather than being imposed by expectation. This is the era we have entered, an era where men are no longer negotiating their peace away, an era where silence replaces argument, an era where walking away is not a protest but a solution. The old assumption that men would always come back was built on misunderstanding. Men came back before because they had no better option. Now they do. And once a better option exists, returning to the old one makes no sense. This is not the end of relationships. It is the end of unconditional participation. It is the end of asymmetry. It is the end of compliance without reciprocity. What happens next depends entirely on whether accountability ever becomes real, not spoken, not promised, demonstrated. Until then, the direction is set. Men have found peace in their solitude, and they are not giving it up. Before we wrap this up, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with what was said, or do you see things differently? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts, because these conversations matter and your perspective adds to them. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.